it, including almost all the pollsters. I had expected to be here this evening talking about what a Clinton administration's policy towards Cuba would look like and how it might be different than Obama's, and whether or not the slim Democratic majority in the Senate would be sufficient to actually push through changes in the embargo in the face of a narrower Republican majority in the House. So I had to spend the time on the train rethinking what I was going to talk about. On the surface, it's pretty clear what happened in this election. The blue-collar, white working class that used to be able to make a good middle-class living without having gone to college can't do that anymore. The process of globalization, deindustrialization, technological development has evaporated those jobs across the Rust Belt, and people's lives have been disrupted by it, and they don't feel, obviously, like they have anyone on their side within the political elite, within the political system. And so, as one of the commentators last night said on television, this was, they didn't really care who Donald Trump was, actually. This was just their way of throwing a Molotov cocktail into Washington because they felt betrayed by the system. I think the reason that so many commentators, so many of us, got it wrong was that we underestimated what the turnout from that constituency would be. As I'm sure you know, pollsters always have to take their raw data and weight it based upon who they think likely voters will be, based upon the demographics of the unit that they're trying to sample, and they derive those weightings from past elections. Well, this wasn't like past elections. This was an anomalous election, and so the weightings were just wrong. And the turnout of that disaffected constituency was far, far higher than it had been historically, and in a lot of places matched or exceeded the Democrats' turnout, which was in a lot of places reasonably high based on the impressive ground game that the Hillary Clinton campaign had. Trump had very little of a ground game, but he had a constituency that was really angry and wanted to send a message. Cuba was not really much of an issue in the campaign. It surfaced once or twice, particularly toward the very end of the campaign, when it was clear that Florida was a must-win state for Trump. He and Mike Pence went to Miami and tried to rally the Cuban-American conservative base by promising to roll back everything that President Obama had done. But earlier in the campaign, Trump had actually said that he thought the opening to Cuba made sense, that the old policy hadn't worked, and it's just that he'd have gotten a better deal than Obama. So I don't think he's particularly wedded as a matter of policy to a particular position, although now he's made a campaign promise which binds him to a certain degree. So I think while Cuba was not really a major issue in the campaign, Cuban-U.S. relations are collateral damage from this election. Let me start out by saying a little bit, just for those of you who may not be fully aware of it, sort of where relations stand sort of at the tail end of the Obama administration, what's really been achieved since December 17th, 2014, just so you have sort of that menu in mind. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I think might happen next and what some of the countervailing forces might be that might structure different options. So at the moment, in the last 2 years, there's actually been enormous diplomatic progress between the two countries. We've signed something like a dozen bilateral relations around a variety of issues of mutual interest: environmental protection, healthcare cooperation, agricultural cooperation, economic cooperation, counter-narcotics cooperation in the security area. So there's really been a pretty amazing amount of progress when you think about it. After 50 years of hostility where not a lot happened, to have that kind of progress. the two countries have put in place what I call the architecture of diplomacy, or the infrastructure of diplomacy, which is they have a bilateral commission of senior diplomats that meets quarterly to sort of map out, take it to assess where they are and map out where the next 3 months will go, and what the priorities will be. There are then working groups which report to that bilateral commission, which are dealing with sort of major clusters of issues like law enforcement, human rights, claims, and so on. And then there are about 24 technical talks that are going on that are dealing with very specific issues and how to implement some of the memoranda of understanding that have been signed between the two countries. President Obama made 5 different rounds of regulatory reform, each one of which punched ever larger holes in the U.S. embargo. The embargo is still in place. It's important to keep that in mind because it was legislated back in 1996. But the president has very broad, some would argue unlimited authority to punch holes in it by licensing transactions that would otherwise be prohibited. And Obama has done a lot of that in the last 2 years. Finally, the last thing he did just in October was to issue a presidential directive, quite long, I think 16 pages if my memory serves, laying out the rationale for his policy of engagement and tasking each of the relevant federal agencies their responsibility for carrying out the policy of engagement. There wasn't much that was brand new in this. It was really a kind of, if you will, executive branch codification of the policy that he was following. And the logic of it was to get sort of in writing the marching orders for the bureaucracy, which they would then follow until they got different marching orders. The expectation, obviously, was that this would sort of set the stage for a Clinton administration to come in and the marching orders would already be in place. What happens now with that, one assumes that probably one of the first things the Trump administration will do is to pull back that presidential directive and write a new one of their own, although that may take them some time. There continue to be a number of issues in conflict between Cuba and the United States, as no surprise. There are remnants of the old policy of hostility that remain in place. The embargo itself, as I mentioned. The United States continues to spend about $20 million annually funding democracy promotion programs, which are aimed at undermining the political foundations of the Cuban government. We still broadcast TV and radio Marti propaganda stations into Cuba, and we still have something called the Cuban Medical Professionals Parole Program, which is a program that offers a fast track to residency and citizenship for Cuban medical personnel serving abroad on humanitarian missions if they will defect to the United States. We still have issues around migration. The United States still has in place the wet foot, dry foot policy, which offers fast track to residency and citizenship for any Cuban refugee or any Cuban migrant who makes it to the United States. Last year, some 45,000 Cubans came across the Texas border and claimed admission under that policy. Cuba regards this obviously as a stimulus for human trafficking, and also for generating a brain drain out of Cuba, which in fact it is. There is the issue of claims. We have claims against Cuba for property nationalized after the revolution that originally about $1.8 billion, now with accumulated interest about $7 billion. Cuba has counterclaims against the United States for damage done by the embargo and for damage done by the CIA's secret wars of the 1960s, somewhere on the order of over $100 billion. So the diplomats have been sitting across the table basically laying out their positions on this issue. I don't think there's been a lot of progress in closing the gap, but at least they've been talking about it. And then there's the issue of human rights. Cuba and the United States have different conceptions of what human rights ought to be priorities. The United States prioritizes political liberties and downplays social and economic rights. Cuba argues that social and economic rights are as important, if not more important, than political liberties. And so there have been 2 meetings of a working group on human rights that have basically exchanged positions with one another. Again, not a lot of progress on that front. And that's, I think it's fair to say, given the different conceptions the two countries have, always going to be, or at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be a point of friction and disagreement. There are elements of the U.S. policy that can only be changed by Congress. The embargo itself, which is codified, written into law in 1996 by the Helms-Burton Act. The ban on pure tourism, which is to say you can't just go lie on a beach. What people call sun and surf tourism, you can't. It's still illegal. And you can't. People who want to sell agricultural goods to the United States cannot get credit to do that. There's a ban on credit for agricultural sales. Both of those things written into law in 2000. And then there's the congressional funding for the democracy programs and TV and Radio Marti. As long as Congress continues to fund those, the president has to spend that money. Can't just impound it. The Supreme Court has said that that's unconstitutional. So a president could restructure those programs, but it doesn't seem like that will be something that the Trump administration will want to do. So what will Donald Trump's policy towards Cuba likely look like? As I say, it wasn't a big issue in the campaign, and the campaign itself, with one or two exceptions, was not highly policy-focused campaign on either side. The sort of consistent things that Mr. Trump talked about were immigration and trade as sort of the two big issues, and how terrible Hillary Clinton was. But in terms of substantive policy issues, those were the key issues. And as I say, Cuba was only mentioned in passing. I will say, though, that the Republican Party platform that was approved at the Republican convention in July is a very hardline, extreme position, written, I would guess, by conservative Cuban Americans in the Congress. It reads like something straight out of the Cold War. It begins by, I don't have the exact quote, it begins by saying something like, we look forward to welcoming the Cuban people back into the community of the Americas after their tyrannical regime is overthrown and their leaders are held to account for their crimes against humanity. I mean, that literally is the sort of the kind of language that characterizes it. So people within the Republican Party who have a special interest in U.S.-Cuban relations have the most retrograde opinions about what the policy should be. And the reality is that it will be mid-level officials who will largely define and carry out U.S. policy towards Cuba. This is not something that Mr. Trump in the White House is going to spend a lot of his time on. He's going to be focused on the issues that he said are important to him: immigration, trade, improving relations with Russia, etc. So a lot depends on who gets appointed in various positions within the U.S. government bureaucracy: Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy in the Western Hemisphere, etc. The National Security Council Staff Director for Latin America and for Cuba. And we just have no idea who those people might be. The best guess is that it will be people who have held similar positions in previous Republican administrations, simply because that's the way this kind of staffing is normally done in Washington. But this is an administration unlike any we've ever seen, and so, or will be an administration unlike any we've ever seen. And so it might be just a completely different approach. There are a couple of possibilities of what might happen. Probably the best one, from my point of view, since I think the president's policy of engagement made a lot of sense, probably the best is that forward motion will stop, or largely stop, but what's been achieved won't be undone, right? So one could make an argument, for example, that having a U.S. embassy in Havana is more in the interests of the United States than only having an interests section or having no diplomatic representation at all. And so one might convince a Trump administration not to rupture diplomatic relations. One could argue that the dozen agreements that have been reached between the two governments in the last 2 years are all on issues of mutual interest that benefit the United States as much as they benefit Cuba, and therefore ought not be repudiated. But I think it's probably inevitable that a number of the exceptions to the embargo that have been made are going to be undone. I mean, that's the essence of what Trump pledged to the conservative Cuban-American community in Miami. And so I think he will feel, in some sense, obligated to carry through on at least some rolling back of the commercial openings. So are there some countervailing forces to prevent a complete return to a policy of hostility? There are some, but I have to say I think they're relatively weak. Congress, of course, remains fully under Republican control, so it's not likely to act as a brake on an effort to go back to a policy of hostility. I will say, though, that in the Senate, in the current Senate, there were 51 co-sponsors of Senator Jeff Flake's right to travel to Cuba bill, which would have allowed tourist travel. And none of the co-sponsors of that bill have gone away. So there are probably in the new Senate 51 votes for that bill. But the problem is going to be that the Republicans control the floor, and as a matter of policy, they're probably not going to allow a piece of legislation like that to come forward to the floor. It might be possible to put an amendment on an appropriations bill, but then in the House of Representatives you are going to have a sort of Republican wall, if you will, that is going to be opposed to any kind of improvement in relations. There was some hope that Paul Ryan might be open to chipping away at least at elements of the embargo. He had been in the 1990s a member of the first Cuba Working Group, which was a bipartisan group of members of the House of Representatives that were opposed to the embargo. He was a member of it based on his libertarian belief in free trade. But he made a statement just recently that reflects more the attitude of the Republican caucus, which is, we're not going to do anything to relax the embargo on Cuba. So, so the Congress, it seems to me, is going to be a weak reed in terms of holding up or defending a policy of engagement. Public opinion, American public opinion, is very supportive of Obama's policy. Over 60% of respondents in a couple of polls have endorsed the president's policy. In a recent poll from Florida International University found that a little over 50% of Cuban Americans supported the policy of engagement. Now, the problem with public opinion, of course, is that it doesn't necessarily have any political muscle outside of elections. And most Americans may support engagement with Cuba, but that's not how they vote. They don't vote on that issue. Cuban Americans do vote on that issue, and so the fact that a significant part of the community favors Obama's policy may be a bit of a constraint on Republican efforts to roll back some of the regulatory openings. I would note that when George W. Bush was president and was tightening the U.S. embargo, his tightening against Cuban American travel and remittances was limited. In other words, he didn't just cut off remittances and travel by Cuban Americans because travel and remittances were so popular in the community and he didn't want to alienate it. So you may see a similar dynamic. Here, and even as some of the regulatory openings are rolled back, it may be that that Cuban American freedom to travel and Cuban American freedom to send remittances to family may remain in place. The business community, of course, has been very interested in commercial relations with Cuba since December 17th, 2014. I think the problem is that those relations have been very slow to develop. So there are really only a handful of actual contractual agreements. There are about a dozen MOUs, but very few of them have actually produced implementable commercial relations. And why? The point is that there are not yet many businesses that have vested interests on the island that they will defend politically. So I think what's more likely to happen is that you will see the business community sort of step back from Cuba, hunker down, and wait for a more inviting political environment here in the United States. Once again, we saw this in the transition from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration back in 2000. At the tail end of the Clinton administration, when there was a bit of a thaw in U.S. Cuban relations, there was a big push by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and some other people in the business community to open up the embargo and get into Cuba. George W. Bush became president, pursued a policy of hostility, and the business community said, oh, well, the doors are closed for now, we'll have to come back later. Finally, a return to the policy of hostility towards Cuba would be very costly in Latin America for the United States. The Latin American opposition to the old policy is one of the reasons that President Obama changed it in the first place. As Ben Rhodes, one of the negotiators of the secret agreement and Deputy National Security Advisor, said, the old policy of hostility towards Cuba had become an albatross around the neck of U.S. relations with the rest of the hemisphere. And sure enough, when the policy was changed and the president went to the Summit of the Americas in Panama in April, he and Raul Castro were warmly received because of this change in U.S. policy. So there will be a cost to pay in Latin America, but I venture to say that the bigger cost to pay in Latin America is going to have to do with Trump's pledge to get rid of NAFTA and build a wall on the southern border of the United States. So those are really going to be the issues that I think are going to inflame U.S.-Latin American relations, and the Cuban issue will just sort of add to that inflammation. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's, I think, a range of possibilities which, as I say, go from not rolling back everything that's been done and maintaining the things that are clearly in the interest of the United States, to on the sort of far extreme, going really back to a policy from the depths of the Cold War in which the embargo is fully implemented and we cut off the diplomatic channels that we already have.
Thank you very much, Bill. Ernesto, the view from Havana.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I don't know if there's a view from Havana. It's my own view about it. Yeah, I just want to say that. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for Bill for sharing his time with me. I think this is a very interesting moment, the one we're living right now. And as I was saying earlier, when we were talking, no Cuban is completely outsider from what happens here in the States, but it's not an insider either. So we have this sort of mixed perspective. One thing that I think is very important, I think your idea about the blue-collar workers and their grievances and all of that was a fundamental factor in all of this. And I just wanted to add something. In those conditions, there came this proposal that included a very simple answer to a very complex question. The question of, well, why we are in the position that we are, how we're going to get better, and it included a series of simple answers that were very easy for people, for common people, with poorly educated people, as he said, Trump said that he loved poorly educated people, to get and to adopt as their own position in all of these issues. So essentially it was a fundamental factor, along with all other things that we may discuss at some point, which are strategic and tactical mistakes made by Hillary Clinton's campaign, like the Rust Belt, and essentially taking the Rust Belt for granted and all of that. So we can, we could discuss on those issues, have a discussion on those issues. But the fundamental factor is that there was a very important, very deep projection towards the establishment from both sides of the spectrum, and that eventually led to these results. Because of course, at the end, Donald Trump emerged as the candidate that was effectively, at least in the speech, opposing that establishment. That being said, in the case of Cuba, I agree that was not an important issue, although it was considered one of the factors that eventually gave him Florida, because his very very recent, actually, remarks on the future of the policy towards Cuba and the idea of changing everything back and repeal many of the Obama's policies, which apparently attracted some, especially of the old Cuban citizens that have the right to vote in Florida. Not the community at large, but especially among the old Cubans who are the most interested in keeping this policy going on. Because within the Cuban American community, I think it's very clear that there's a huge divide that is growing between the older generations and the newer immigrants and the second, third generation Cubans, the pure Cuban Americans, if you want to call it like that. And there is a very important divide, especially the new immigrants here in the States that now are over 50% of the Cuba-born Cuban Americans. But of course, the levels of either naturalization or the percentage of them that are registered to vote and that actually vote is much lower than those of the older Cuban immigrants in Florida. So they are a majority of the community, and those are the ones that are the most interested in opening the relationship, because of course they have relatives in Cuba, they have families, and they have a very different education, social background, a very different history, personal history. So they look at this process in a very different way. But of course, the older ones are the ones that have most of the power, economic power, political power, and the ones who vote the most. Because Cuban American, typically the older Cuban Americans, they have a turnout, average turnout, which is way above the average turnout in the States. It's about 75%, something like that, which is a very high one, really, really high one. So these are facts that should be remembered when we are dealing with this. That doesn't mean that these speeches by Donald Trump will no matter what, bind him in this particular sense. According to his peculiarities as a candidate and as future president, he might act in we don't know which way. Because the most important word, I think, to define Donald Trump right now is uncertainty. And it's probably the characteristic that is the most interesting on one hand as a scholar, but on the other hand is the one that is the most frightening, which is we don't know what he is actually going to do. So we are in that particular position. So what we can do is try to project a little bit about that and to think about which may be the different factors shaping his policies in this case. One of them may come from his old history with Cuba, because he has a history with Cuba, not a big one, but some history with Cuba, and may have some level of interest as a business person, which is not a traditional politician, which is not a military officer. So as a businessman, he may have a different view, depending on how his interests he thinks that are better promoted. If in this environment or a different one, that may be part of his decision-making process, as well as, of course, the idea of who's going to be the person, all the persons appointed to these different positions that may be that will have the actual responsibility of enforcing any policy, which is probably the biggest question here, because some of them may be part of the old Republican cohort of different people that have been for a long time enforcing the embargo/blockade, as we call it in Cuba. Blockade, not embargo. But I won't go through that discussion because it's not a too big one to have here right now. But definitely that's a very important part of all of this. And also, I think that we have been discussing about these issues back in Cuba, and I've always had the idea that most of the future of the policy will depend on the interest of the different power groups within the United States and the balance between among them, those power groups. And The only important economic areas where there has been significant progress have been the commercial flights, which is growing and is sort of big right now, and a couple of older agreements, especially Starwood hotels starting to operate. A couple of hotels in Cuba, which is one of them that is already operating, is a Sheraton one, and if you're about not too many agreements. It's all about potential. It's all about possibilities. So, will this potential be enough for them to push for keeping, at the very least, keeping the current state of affairs, or to put it forward? I'm not quite sure about it. I do agree that the best possible scenario that I can foresee right now is trying to keep things in the way they are. But I think that it's a very important possibility that at least in some aspects there will be a backlashing of this. There will be a kind of a return to previous situation. Maybe not December the 16th, 2014. Maybe, hopefully not. But it is possible, certainly possible, because everything has been built on the base of executive orders, and essentially no legislation has been passed. So, without any legislation and only on the basis of executive orders, the president have the legal power to actually change everything back. It will depend on this combination of factors. Which will be, I think that most probably one way to look at this will be the possibility of using some of these issues, some of these different agreements, or actually the possibility of repealing some of this agreement as a leverage in any future negotiation. I mean, threatening with cutting the relation with Cuba, for example, in exchange for better opportunities for American interests in Cuba or for political changes in Cuba. Because when you actually read the different changes introduced, I mean the policies that were implemented and announced and enforced in the last couple of years, some of them they do, and certainly they are better for Cuba than what we had before, but they're also targeting to help or to promote American interests, not only the political sense. I'm talking about the economic sense. I'm talking about business. I'm talking about creating ways to have an actual influence on Cuba. So most of it goes essentially in the American interest, not so much in the Cuban interest. Although of course it helps Cuba. It's way better to have this discussion than to be under the threat of military invasion, whatever. It's a very different environment. So I think that from that point of view, it may be possible to keep going in sort of a mixed process in which these different components of the current state of affairs and the current relation will be observed, may be observed carefully, and may be used in this sense, trying to exercise some sort of pressure on the Cuban government, looking for changes in Cuba. That will be the right-wing, typical, traditional Cuban American elite position, if not cutting the whole process altogether. Or the other possibility, I think, will be that trying to open more room for American business in Cuba, breaking the limits imposed by the Cuban law and by the Cuban political system, could be used as a way to promote those interests. In that sense, with the use of forms of leverage of the possibility of just cutting the relation, the whole thing with just one signature, which would be the worst possible scenario, just to go back to the 100% Cold War structure that we had until December 17, 2014. In the midst of that, there is something that is currently happening and that we should look at it carefully, which is the emerging cross-border development of businesses between Cuban Americans in Florida or elsewhere in the States and Cubans in Cuba. Because part of the flow of money across the border is not only remittances, it's also investment. And this is creating a different set of conditions because we're talking about people that even among those, some of those old Cuban Americans, although this is mostly, apparently according to the evidence I have, is mostly something that is coming from the newer Cuban Americans, to put it in that sort of weird expression, is creating a relationship that essentially accepts the current political system in Cuba, or at the very least, it can deal with it. Because of course, it's people that is operating in Cuba or opening business in Cuba through their families, but it's receiving some profit from that, it's making some profit out of it, within the limits of the current Cuban law. And maybe in some of those cases operating with formerly property that was nationalized at some point, and a few other of those assets that I think is a very important development, which is not yet studied to the extent that it deserves, but is something to consider. And sorry. And also something that we may, or we should also consider, and I have no scientific evidence, not enough scientific evidence of that, but I have some very early, very first, let's say, news about it, some very small piece of information. Some of the people that eventually voted Trump were not against the current Cuba policy by the United States. It's people that voted Trump because of some of the problems that led a large part of the American population to vote for Trump, not because of the Cuban case. And I don't know if Trump himself or Mike Pence or the Republican leadership in general is aware of that, but there are some, let's say, public figures within the community that are openly in favor of denormalization, that openly said that they would vote, and eventually they did it, they vote for Trump. So it's not, there is not 100% equivalence between Trumpers or Trump supporters or Trump voters, whatever you want to call it, is among the Cuban Americans and people that is against the current policy towards Cuba. So my general idea will be, we have a very high level of uncertainty here, and there are too many different factors and too many different things that we don't know. I think that the first couple of steps will be, the first step will be backwards. Step back and just look at what the future administration will look like, who will be in office in all these different mid-level, which I agree are the fundamental part of this story, mid-level offices, and how the different interests, including the Cuban Americans, including the business sectors here in the States, including, of course, the Cuban position in all of this that have to be considered also. How will Cuba deal with President Trump? It's interesting to me to imagine either Fidel or Raul Castro having a conversation with Donald Trump. That might be interesting. Yeah. And we need to consider all these different aspects before having an actual, I won't say accurate, but at least more or less useful perspective on this process. Those were just a few early ideas. I think that we can go way beyond that.
Over the next few days and weeks.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you very much. We're going to open it up now. We have about a half an hour for questions, etc. So I invite you to make questions, but how many people want to? Shall we take them all at once since we're a small group, or how many people have questions?
One over here, Meg.
1, 2, 3. Okay, why don't we collect all 3 of them, and then you
Do
can
another
both
round if we
respond.
want,
Yeah. Mhm. Why don't we start here?
Are there younger Cuban American Republican politicians that may have a slightly different interests or positions?
Okay. Was there? Somebody here? Okay, there, and then Bill.
I guess I was curious in digging a little bit deeper into the Cuban government's point of view about the current situation, and whether indeed just getting a better sense of how the current situation really is being embraced or not embraced by the Cuban government. Because I know in some of the situations that I've been in, to different symposia and all of that, I myself have gotten some what I think are mixed messages on
Okay. Bill?
Well, we know that, Trump is going to build a wall, and we know that he's going to build a wall. And that we know that NAFTA is going to be renegotiated. Now, it's very unlikely, and I sort of disagree with you about that will upset the détente. I think those two things can go ahead without upsetting, the developments that are going on in Cuba. Now, if we look at Trump in the larger issue of his foreign policies, he doesn't want a war with China over the South Seas. He doesn't want a war, with Russia over the East Ukrainian conflict. In fact, he really wants to try to, go into these things. He doesn't want a no-fly. I mean, he's not a hawk. So, I mean, that's the context. That's another context. He's not a troublemaker in the foreign policy area. And I don't think that he would, upset the ongoing, developments in Cuba, because that would be very upsetting, as you say, if he did. And I mean, I say that based upon, I think what his whole, foreign policy, orientation is, that, he wants more peace, I think. Oh, and also, with the Afghanistan thing, I mean, he thinks, you have to negotiate something, with Pakistan to get the Taliban, involved, so you can get the hell out of there, So, I mean, these are really mature foreign policy policies, that can reflect upon, that he won't change things in Cuba, I don't think. But I do agree with you. It's going to be very hard to find people to implement on that mid-level area.
Okay.
Okay. So there are a lot of Cuban Americans with very different views. And you may know better than I, but there may be some of them at the local level in terms of local politics, but I can't think of any that have really broken through at the national level, right? I mean, Joe Garcia, who's not all that much younger, but a Democrat, Cuban-American Democrat who was defeated again, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, was defeated again. He held Congress. He was in Congress for one term because he ran against a scandal, a Republican mired in scandal. Then he was defeated last time around, and now he's defeated again, trying to get the seat back. So, I mean, thus far, for a lot of the reasons that we just heard, the older, more conservative element in the community is the politically more powerful element in the community. And so it's been hard for people who have a more moderate point of view to get much traction politically. But there are a growing number of Cuban Americans, younger and older, who are taking a different point of view on this issue. And so I think really it's an issue that is going to resolve itself demographically over time as the older generation retires and dies off and is replaced by generations of Cuban Americans who've come more recently for economic reasons and still have ties to family, and so on and so on and so forth. And we've already seen it. If you look at the Florida International Public Opinion polls among Cuban Americans that began in 1991 and trace it all the way up to today, the trends are just virtually straight in terms of the percentages of the community in favor of better relations, in wanting to get rid of the embargo, and so on and so on and so forth. It's just that they haven't. They're not in political control at this point. Cuban government's view. Well, the Cuban government, I will say, was scrupulous about not commenting on the American presidential race. And when directly asked about it, Josefina Vidal, who is the general director for the United States in the foreign ministry, she's the lead negotiator for Cuba in the negotiations of the bilateral commission, said that she hoped whoever was elected would respect the views of the American people, which were strongly in favor of the policy of engagement. Punto. No, she didn't say anything more than that. And I first thing I did this morning was to look at Granma online to see what the Cuban daily newspaper, to see what the response was. And there was a short headline that said, Trump wins American presidential election. And about 150 words that were just a straight report of the outcome of the election. And above that story, the banner headline was, Cuba announces 2016 national defense exercises. Now, Cuba always does a national defense exercise around this time of year, but I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that they had a big announcement about it on the same day that they were writing the story about Donald Trump. In terms of Trump being in favor of more of a retrenchment and a pulling in terms of foreign policy and not getting involved in conflicts abroad, or trying to extricate the United States from conflicts abroad, except for bombing the crap out of ISIS. I mean, I think that's true. My concern about his policy towards Cuba is that I'm fearful that Cuba is going back to being a domestic political issue rather than a foreign policy issue, right? Which is what it was from basically the end of the Cold War up until December 17th, 2014. Because it wasn't important anymore after the Cold War as a foreign policy issue, it could be a domestic political football, and Republican politicians would play to conservative Cuban Americans to get their votes by having a hard line on Cuba. And my fear is that we'll go back to that as indicated by Trump reversing his position of initially being in favor of Obama's policy to saying he was going to roll it back in the heat of the campaign. Now, maybe now that the campaign's over, he'll back away from that. But those kind of campaign promises are tough to back entirely away from. You can try to, hedge it here and there, but when you've gone out and explicitly said to one of your core constituencies that you will do X for them, you have to do something for them. You can't just blow them off. Not if you want to run again.
Yes. Obviously, the elected Cuban American officials at the federal level, all of them are essentially conservative, and all of them are essential, except for Bob Menendez, which is in everything else is not a conservative, but it is a conservative. He is a conservative in the Cuban American relations, which is his downside as a senator, by the way. Just listen to the names. I mean, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, which is not so much a Cuban American from Florida, but still has been clearly opposing all of this, essentially because of his very conservative political positions. And the representative from either from Florida or the one from West Virginia, I don't even know from where this guy came from. But anyway, I don't know how it worked, but how it went the first time, but again. So non-elected official at the federal level is in favor of this change in policy, at least publicly. It may change if their constituencies change, because of course, except for some of them, most of them are career politicians, so they kind of have to move their positions according to their constituencies. But of course, that may take time. And also very important in the case of those that are from Florida, the people who is actually funding their political careers within Florida, among the Cuban Americans, are those connected to this traditional position, because those are the ones that have most of the economic resources there, and those are the ones that have been building and managing the political machinery that they actually put in place at the very least 30, 40 years ago, 35, 40 years ago, especially in the 80s, although it had certain previous developments. So the Cuban Americans in politics that are in favor of this change are not in those areas, are essentially they belong to different groups that have been trying to lobby, to do some lobbying in favor of all of this, even within Florida, but essentially outside Florida. So what we are seeing now in that sense is sort of a divergence between the evolution of the Cuban American community as a whole and its political representation, especially at the federal level. That is a fundamental reality which at some point, and I agree with that, at some point that should change when the community itself eventually shift altogether. But, and I'm connecting this with the third question, or the third comment, yes, I think that one of the worst things that may happen, and it's probably going to happen, is that Cuba is again, will be again the domestic politics issue, not so much a foreign policy issue. So in that sense, the idea that the Cuban American vote and the Cuban American electoral base is essentially split is important, but those are not supporting the that are supporting the change to the policy towards Cuba are mostly leaning to the Democratic Party. So the Republican electoral base, which is the one that is in this case influential in what is happening, unless that is a very specific attempt to attract the others, are heavily, most of them, in favor of keeping or even reinforcing these policies against the current given government. So it is a little bit more complicated than that. And I know this idea that Trump is not a hawk, but the problem is nobody knows what Trump's administration's foreign policy will look like, and the potential ties with Russia or with China, how that will happen in the future. We really don't know. In this case, I think, well, all foreign policy is, at least in part, domestic policy, domestic politics. That's for sure. But in the Cuban case, which, by the way, probably for many Americans, Latin America and especially Cuba, is not 100% foreign. Is in large part is domestic. Will be essentially, I think, domestic issue, unless it became again important in the relation with Latin America. That may happen, but I don't know about, because of course the wall is the biggest issue. I mean, using the wall just to represent the views of Latin America, because it goes way beyond the wall. And sure, the Cuban government hasn't said anything about any preference, which for any of the candidates. Have been very careful about it. All Cuban public media and all the official speech in Cuba includes nothing about a preference for any of the candidates. The idea is that we will be in the position or willing to work with any of the two administrations that could emerge from this election. Now we know which one is. What we don't know is how it will look like. That's a different thing.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, just to add something, we were talking about the issue of this legislator, Cuban legislator. Unfortunately, I mean, we cannot say that all of them are probably older people. Maybe we'll be from some other generation. We have Marco Rubio, in the early 40s. So, and it has been a key point on the policy towards Cuba. And when you follow what Obama was doing, after every action from Obama, it was a comment right away for all the Cuban legislators, one behind the other, so in line. All of them saying the same. It's like having talking points or whatever. All of them saying the same. Marco Rubio, Bowman, even Ted Cruz. So it's not an issue for him, but he caucused with them in every aspect. So that is really difficult when you are talking or having the possibility of having a change. So when you follow, for instance, there were 3 of them that were running. Curbelo, he defeated clearly Joey Garcia. When you see Albio City here in New Jersey, it was easy for me. He doesn't have anyone competing in any case. So every of the Cuban legislators that are now in the hills, all of them have the benefit of these older people, conservative, but they are the one voting. So we cannot expect something in the near future, a change in this pattern.
And given the historical tradition of trading votes
Yeah.
that the Cuban-American members, or the Cuban-Canadian members of the Congress have done. You know, if you vote for my Cuba amendment, I'll vote for the new base for your, or the new whatever in your state, et cetera, which the Cuban-American members of Congress have always been very effective. I think you're going to have an increase of this because there's going to be a fair amount of money that the White House is going to pour into more or less making the members of Congress more indebted and dependent on the executive branch. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an increase in that.
One of the problems is that some of the Cuban American members have such high seniority that they're extremely influential. And so not only can they say, you know, you vote for me and I'll vote for you, they can say, if you don't vote for me, you won't get the road in your district.
Yeah.
And, you know, the average member, I mean, the average Republican member of Congress, their constituency doesn't care about Cuba. So they are completely free to vote one way or the other. But when one of their colleagues comes to them, an influential colleague, and says, I need you to be with me on this Cuba issue, they have no reason not to go along. And particularly if leadership in their party is also in favor of a tough line on Cuba, they have no reason not to go along. And so the only way you get change in Congress is to give those members a reason to change their position. And that, I think, has to come out of their constituency, and that really means it's business interests in their constituency that go to them and say, we need you to help get rid of the embargo because we have an interest in doing business in Cuba, and it's good for us and good for your district. And then a member can go to Ileana Ros-Lehtinen or Mario Diaz-Balart and say, listen, I've been with you in the past, but I can't be with you now because I'm getting pressure from my constituency. And that's something they can say to the leadership as well. But absent that, it's not a salient enough issue for them to pay any political price to change their position.
Yeah, and in that case, probably the most interesting possibility is what you mentioned earlier about Jeff Flake and his activism in all of this, because of course it is supported by sort of a specific interest in his own state about the agricultural business and people that have been actively trying to promote the development of those connections, even trying to promote trade and the way in which it is framed right now by the law, which is absolutely beneficial for the American potential seller of agricultural products to Cuba, which is of course what they are looking for, although they also may be interested in opening the range of possibilities to other potential businesses. So this is one of the possibilities. Other thing that I think is important is that within the Cuban American community there is something that is going on in economic and social terms, which is the sort of a breakup in the ethnic enclave, using this concept that was essentially defined for the Cubans and then using for other communities. And there is a sort of a Cuban ethnic enclave 2.0 emerging there, maybe, that is formed essentially by the newer immigrants that have been excluded from the benefits of the original ethnic enclave, and they are building all these new economic structures that many of them are interested specifically either in doing business in Cuba or in doing businesses that are oriented to Cuba, either the travel agencies that exist down there, maybe there are several of them, or other small enterprises that are not big in terms of statewide or nationwide economy, much even less, but for the community that is important. We are talking about probably some few thousand of jobs that are connected to that, and some of them even are interested in their businesses selling things to be sent to Cuba. So I'm not saying that that's strong enough to counterweight the importance of the traditional older elite, but at least it's an emerging sector that may gain in influence within the community. How this will translate into political influence, that's yet to be seen, because of course they don't have the political machinery that the other people already put together many years ago. So they have to find their own ways to exercise on it. Even if they, first they have to realize that they need to do that for their own interest, first of all. Not only about personal, but even business interests. And second, they have to find a way to create their own instrument, their own tools to exercise this influence. So there, in that specific state that is so important in every American election, and that is also very important in Congress due to the amount of Congress persons it has. 27 in the House, that's a big number. And the Cuban Americans, as you were saying, especially Ileana Ross, our senior representative. She is have been there for 27 years, 26, 27 years, something like that. One of the oldest in the House. So that gives her a lot of influence. And of course, Diaz Valar also, not so much Curbelo, but then he is connected to these people, so he will capture them, he will join them. Which, by the way, he's even younger than Marco Rubio.
Yeah.
He's even younger. He's younger than me. He's his late 30s. He's the youngest one. Point is that these people, yeah, maybe second generation, but then they were essentially educated by these very same people, and they have their doors open for them because of these people. You know, Marco Rubio served in Ileana Ross' office when he was an intern. So have all connections there. So that's why it is very complicated in this particular scenario that we are witnessing right now.
Just to add on to that, I think that a lot of the groups like the American Manufacturers Association, et cetera, that were fairly active on the Cuban issue are now going to be so preoccupied with possible rollbacks on the multilateral trading agreements and bilateral trading agreements. That's going to be a bigger priority in order to defend those rather than any sort of economic relations with Cuba. And so and also the stabilization of the international or the global economic system. So where they had more space, so to speak, to add on lesser priorities like Cuba under Obama, that's not going to be the case now. They're going to be fighting really for a whole series of issues, economic issues that are more global and involve a lot more of their interests, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a really important one.
Yeah, and also adding to that, the possibility of a recession, which is a reality that is apparently is coming at some point. I cannot predict. I won't advise anyone to predict anything right now, especially based on polls. But still, there are symptoms that we are heading to, U.S. especially, but the world is heading to a new recession that may be even worse than the last one. Maybe, maybe not. But if that happens in the near future, that will also be a factor. It will be playing. I'm not going to be playing in favor or against, but most of the economic power, the economic groups will be interested or trying to cope with the recession. And I don't know if they may think about Cuba as an opportunity to overcome some of the, Cuba is too tiny for that, but to help to overcome some of these processes or not. Maybe it could be considered a liability more than an asset. It will depend on how they interpret this situation, and they interpret their possibilities in the Cuban case. Because of course they will be not pouring money and other resources into some potential development that they will not give them, or they will that might be at the end damaging for them in a situation in which they may have to gather all their possibilities, to all the resources to deal with a situation that may be way more complicated than the one they already have now. So this is part of the story too.
Before we adjourn, I want to remind you that on November 17th, we will have Humberto Blanco, the director of the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the University of Havana, will be speaking from 6 to 8 in this room on the current status of the Cuban economy and some future projections. Obviously, he'll probably refer also to the impact of the Trump election. Secondly, I want to remind people that Bill LeoGrande and Ernesto Dominguez Lopez are both authors of chapters in a new book that the Cuba program here is publishing December 16th, if I live, and that will be out and available for sale in January. And we're very proud of it. It deals with a whole series of issues, including the sanctions claims, immigration, all of which have been mentioned here. And we're very delighted that it's going to appear shortly. And it is a project jointly between Columbia University and the Instituto Superior de Relaciones Internacionales in Havana. And finally, well, we want to thank you for coming tonight when we all probably would have been happier having some drinks. Thank you. And contemplating the future.
There's plenty of time tonight for that. What is the title of the book that or is that still in process?
No, we have one. It's Cuba U.S Normalization, challenges? What is it? Help me out here.
I don't know.
And the subtitle has challenges in it.
Okay.
The challenges of normalization. It's Cuba U.S. relations, challenges of normalization.
Okay.
Perfect title for these days.
Yeah, it took us forever to get one. We had several ugly
Get plenty of
titles.
challenges.
Yes, right. Anyway,
One which is the definition of normalization or normal
yeah.
in this moment. It's not that easy. It's two different perspectives of normal.
Right.
I think it's very clear.
One of the original titles was normalizing the abnormal, but we decided that was too peculiar.
Yeah.
So we needed something.
Sounds like a psychology text.